Hello and welcome to the History Revision video podcast. This is Politics 1964 to 1970. Okay, Labour 1964 to 66. Well, Wilson entered government with goodwill and optimism. He had a classless image. He was the first Prime Minister not educated at private school, for example, and he seemed in with the modern trends. Heath, who took over the Conservatives in 1965, found it difficult to compete with Wilson's air of political authority. Wilson employed lots of scientists as government advisors. In 1965, Parliament voted against capital punishment, and there was a new Race Relations Act in the same year. Wilson, though, was worried about his small majority, don't we all? Though Wilson was bordering on paranoia over what he believed to be biased and hostile coverage by the BBC. So he called an election in March 1966 to consolidate his political position. And despite frustrations over economic policies, Labour got a decisive victory in 1966. Heath had found it difficult to connect with voters, and Labour was still seen as a fresh start after the 13 years of Tory misrule. They won with a 98 majority, which is the biggest share since 1945 for Labour, and is 110 seats over the Conservatives. Wilson was still paranoid though, refusing to do interviews on election night. Labour 1966-70. Wilson was very sensitive to criticism from within the Labour Party, and he relied on his kitchen cabinet of close advisers rather than the real cabinet of elected MPs. One of his kitchen cabinet advisers was Marcia Williams, aka Baroness Falkender. Lynch says that in this period the government only had a small amount of influence in shaping the transition from an industrial to a service economy. And 2 IMF loans in 3 years suggested Labour were not in control of the economy at all. Devaluation in 1967 was more of a political disaster than an economic one, and Wilson's claim that it would mean the pound in your pocket was worth any less, or wasn't worth any less, seemed pathetic. He turned the whole issue into a drama, which he didn't need to do. Wilson's application to the EC was backed by all the Conservatives and all the Liberals, but not all the Labour MPs, 36 of them opposed, and that ended also in political humiliation. There was a lot of problems with industrial unrest. Now, since the war, all parties had attempted to keep full employment and to keep the unions happy. And in 1960, 60% of people had a positive view of the unions. They had helped to organise conscription during the war. Previous Prime Ministers had cooperated with the unions when agreeing prices and incomes policies. And to start off, it seemed like Wilson was going to do the same thing. For example, he employed Frank Cousins as his Minister of Technology, and Frank Cousins was a strong trade unionist. Mind you, Frank Cousins later resigned over the introduction of the Prices and Incomes Board. Wilson relied on keeping a good relationship with the TUC, and negotiations were often done over beer and sandwiches at Number 10. By 1966-67, this was falling apart. Big strikes by the seamen and the dockers caused the government big problems. Wilson himself interpreted them as more than just industrial disputes. He brought in emergency laws, a state of emergency, as he saw it as sabotage from communists who were using the strike for political means. He was also convinced that the unions were a large part of the economic sluggishness. And he was right to an extent. I mean, lots of the strikes were now started by wildcat strikes. The old union-style bosses were less in control of their members, and the members were taking action themselves, the wildcat strikes. Meanwhile, on the right, Edward Heath was proposing a policy called a fair deal at work, so it looked as though the government had to do something themselves and intervene. Wilson and Barbara Castle planned to use the law, a white paper called In Place of Strife, to curb the union powers. This obviously upset the Labour left big time, and the trade unions themselves. It was to bring in a 28-day cooling off period. It was to bring in strike ballots that could be imposed forcibly. The government could impose settlements in disputes between unions, and there would be a court set up to prosecute any rule breakers. There were going to be some restrictions on employers, but not enough to keep the unions happy. It was popular with the voters, and Labour's rating in the polls went up. However, the unions, the left-wing MPs, Jim Callaghan, Joe Gormley, leader of the NUM, strongly protested, and 50 Labour MPs were ready to rebel. The Labour Party was supposed to protect the unions. That's why the party was set up, is what they said. Wilson eventually gave in. The TUC negotiated a face-saving compromise, but in reality it was a huge climb down, and it left Barbara Castle high and dry. The Conservative government went on to introduce much stronger regulations, and therefore the unions might have been better actually accepting In Place of Strife, but that's another story. Something else that the Labour government this time did politically was social reform. Now, we will have a look at this another time, but it's also a political factor. And they introduced the Race Relations Act, Acts in 1965 and 68, which, amongst other things, prohibited racial discrimination in public places, housing and employment, introduced a Community Relations Commission to set up to promote interracial understanding. The Abortion Act was in 1967. It allowed legal termination where two doctors agreed. This was highly controversial between, obviously, women's rights to choose and murder. However, some would say that anything was better than these backstreet abortions that were going on before. The Sexual Offences Act in 1967 permitted male homosexual acts between two consenting adults. Female homosexuality was not even mentioned, as it wasn't legal in the first place. The Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1968 limited immigration to those who already had family here. The Theatres Act in 1968 ended censorship in the theatre, and the abolition of the death penalty in 1969 made permanent a measure taken in 1965 for a 4-year trial. This removed the 5 remaining offences still eligible for hanging. The Divorce Reform Act in 1969 stopped people having to be caught in flagrante to get a divorce. The Open University was set up in 1969. Most of this was overseen by Roy Jenkins, and he was particularly liberal as Home Secretary between 1965 and 67. Some of them were private members' bills, not brought in by government. For example, the abortion one was David Steele, the Liberal MP, but Jenkins' support made it easier for them to do this. The 1970 election. Despite trade union and foreign policy problems, the economy was recovering, and Wilson's political position looked strong in 1970 when he called the election. He was confident of winning. However, Labour had suffered the image of failure in the devaluation crisis, as raising taxes under Jenkins, the European application being refused. Labour were complacently campaigning. The Conservatives had been ahead in the polls, despite Heath's personal ratings not being as high as Wilson's, and key marginals were showing the Conservatives had a lead. Labour had lost a lot of seats in by-elections in the previous years, and Heath resisted immigration as an issue. But people may still have voted Conservative because of the sacked Enoch Powell. Immigration was an issue, whether he liked it or not, and people who were against it were more likely to vote Conservative. And the Tories ended up winning by a majority of 30. So let's have a look at some historical interpretation. Churchill said after World War II, the working class trade unions had become an estate of the realm. Peter Townsend said on Labour reform, it was merely a hot compress on an ailing body politic. Jenkins himself said if one is looking for a starting date for the permissive age, it would start in 1960 with the Lady Chatterley's lovers case, which was found not guilty. Jenkins also said a more appropriate name for it would be the civilised age rather than the permissive age. Left-wing criticism of the Labour government would be that it saw rising unemployment, growing inflation, increased wage controls, an attempted restriction of trade unions, immigration controls, a failure to join Europe, or even attempting to join Europe, and a retention of nuclear weapons, plus US support for the US in Vietnam. R.W. Johnson, a voting expert, said of all those who had switched their votes from one party to another in 1970, in the election then, 50% were working class powerlights, supporting Enoch Powell. Lynch says as a failure to control the unions cost Wilson's government a significant degree of support amongst moderate voters. Tony Benn said Powell was a real leader of the Conservative Party. Andrew Marr says the evidence is thin to prove Powell was responsible for the 1970 victory, and the real reason was more a bad balance of payment figures plus bad inflation figures that were recently published before it. Peter Shaw says devaluation was terribly damaging to Wilson personally. Wilson felt it, and it was damaging to him politically as well, and to the whole coherent reputation and authority of the Labour government. Ken Morgan says industrial relations was this government's particular claim to understanding and authority, and in the end, its most disastrous failure. Wilson said of the striking seamen that they were a tightly knit group of politically motivated extremists, and this was to the House of Commons. Wilson saw the Open University as his finest achievement. He also blamed the 1970 defeat on the weather, saying it was too hot. Philip Whitehead said the government had lost both the trade union support for being too tough, with the white paper in place to strike, and some public support by appearing in the last analysis to be too weak. Clive Ponting said the government had a significant impact on social attitudes and the lives of ordinary people. Derek Murphy says possibly the greatest achievement was a narrowing gap of the richest and the poorest in society. He also says Wilson didn't believe in anything very much. Dennis Healy said about Wilson he had no purpose of direction and rarely looked more than a few months ahead. David Marquand says no modern British government has disappointed their supporters so thoroughly, and Tony Benn says power slipped through our fingers because we were saying nothing very useful to people.